Nintendo is arguably the most iconic name in video game history. They have had a catalogue of incredible games since more than 30 years ago, and they're showing no signs of stopping with their slated future releases for the Nintendo Switch. Nintendo is a giant in the video game industry that revolutionized game design in many ways, and because of that, they've earned the respect of millions of dedicated fans. But despite Nintendo's track record of releasing banger after banger, their adoring fans are rapidly starting to dislike their corporate overlords at Nintendo. Nintendo, the once beloved company, is becoming a bit of a pariah in the gaming industry nowadays. And honestly, their reputation's tanking for good reason. In 2020, there was a Melee tournament slated to be held in October of that year. That tournament was the Big House. This would have been the 10th annual Big House tournament, and people were pretty excited about it. That was until, the world said no. So instead, they organised an online tournament to be held in December of that year. How do they play a GameCube game from 2001 online? Well, they use an emulator, and they used a Slippy mod. Slippy is a completely fan-made mod that allows Melee to be played online with a bunch of quality of life changes, like matchmaking systems and rollback netcode. So Slippy's netcode is better than Nintendo's netcode for their own service that costs money. This is foreshadowing. So everyone was hyped to play in this online tournament, but on November 19th, 2020, the tournament organisers announced that they had been sent a cease and desist letter by Nintendo of America. Nintendo's reasoning for sending this cease and desist was that the tournament was using illegally copied versions of the game, and they were using the Slippy mod. They were using an emulator. That's what Nintendo didn't like. They were using an emulator to play their game online, which is something that wouldn't be possible without emulation and the Slippy mod that was created by the community. The competitive scene's outcry about this event was enormous, having the hashtag #FreeMelee trend on Twitter for what felt like weeks, but it didn't matter. This was not the first time that Nintendo had shut down a Smash tournament, and it will not be the last. Nintendo didn't allow MLG to stream Smash Bros. Brawl back in 2010. Nintendo even tried to shut down the entirety of EVO 2013, the biggest fighting game tournament in the world, just because they were streaming a Smash tournament there. Nintendo has, in 2021, announced that they are directly supporting a Smash Melee tournament in collaboration with Panda Global, which would be the first time in the game's entire life that Nintendo has acknowledged the competitive scene of Melee. But if Nintendo's anti-emulation stance continues, this will not be the last time this happens. And speaking of that stance, by the way, as you can see from Nintendo nuking a Melee tournament just for the use of an emulator, Nintendo has had a very heavy anti-piracy and anti-emulation stance for a long time, and they have shown their hatred for this in the past many times. The main way they show their hatred is lawsuits against websites that host ROMs and emulators of Nintendo's games. But at first glance, this one makes a lot of sense. Piracy and emulation could impact Nintendo's bottom line. They will lose profits from people getting these games for free instead of buying them from Nintendo. Well, there's just one issue. Nintendo has no legitimate avenue to buy the overwhelming majority of their retro catalogue of games. They released some of them, sure, like the Mario 3D All-Stars pack, or the expansion pack for Nintendo Online that gives you, and I quote, a growing library of classic Nintendo 64 and Sega Mega Drive games. But things like this are few and far between, and they don't even host half of the entire catalogue of Nintendo's beloved games that you might want to play. Emulation is extraordinarily important for the preservation of video game history, because if the companies themselves don't sell these games, they just fade into obscurity. The only way to keep them alive is emulation. So if Nintendo doesn't sell the game, but they also attack emulation, there's no way to play these games. And for the overwhelming majority of games, this is true. There is no legal way to purchase these games from Nintendo. They don't sell or manufacture their old consoles, or their old games, so unless it's in one of these bundles, or you want to buy an overpriced antique on eBay, you're out of luck. In fact, Smash Bros. Melee hasn't been on sale for more than a decade now. But if you emulate the game that they don't sell in order to play the game that they don't sell, offline or online, Nintendo thinks you're a bastard. God forbid you want to host a tournament for that game. There's no doubts in my mind that if Nintendo sold these games, people would buy them. But Nintendo makes no effort to do so, but they will still relentlessly pursue ROM sites and tournaments for no personal gain whatsoever, just out of principle. And speaking of taking legal action for no personal gain just out of principle, Nintendo, up until very recently, has had a very long track record of copyright striking their gameplay footage and music on YouTube, with this YouTube copyright strike screen becoming a literal meme on the internet because of it. And this, again, is basically for no personal gain. Let's Play channels and Twitch streamers are great marketing for a game. Someone on stream or someone in a Let's Play saying that your game is great and is worth the purchase is a far better advertisement than any TV slot or pre-roll ad that Nintendo could possibly buy. Also, how the hell did Steve Harrington get into this Amiibo ad?
DK's in, this is gonna be bananas.
And why did they make Steve Harrington main Donkey Kong? Doesn't make any sense. Surely he'd main someone else, like maybe he'd main. And most companies know this, hence why nobody ever willingly copyright strikes their own free advertising. But not Nintendo. Nintendo loves to throw these strikes at people's channels just for a laugh. See, well it's actually not for no personal gain. See, because Nintendo had this thing. They had the Nintendo Creators Program on YouTube, where you had to sign up to giving away a huge chunk of your ad revenue to Nintendo, just so that you could play their games on YouTube. Luckily this was scrapped in 2018. But this was the explanation for why Nintendo was doing this. Because why take the free advertising if they can instead take money directly out of your pockets while simultaneously crushing their own brand image? In addition to copyright striking YouTube content, they also like to send cease and desist letters to fan games and mods for using their intellectual property. Many great Nintendo fan projects have been shut down just because of Nintendo brainlessly disliking any attempt at using their IP, even if it's not for profit. Like Mario Royale, an online Mario racing game that took the original Mario game and had you race against 74 other players online. Nintendo sent a cease and desist letter to this game, and they had to change their name to DMCA Royale and replace the Mario sprites with some other random dude. You might think that Nintendo did this so that they could make their own version of the game and actually make a profit off of it or something. But no, it was struck down on principle. Such is the fate of every Nintendo fan project or mod ever made. The most egregious one, though, in my opinion, is Htwo Joy-Cons. A popular Nintendo content creator called Htwo passed away in 2019. So a fan designed and made these Htwo Joy-Cons, custom controllers for the Nintendo Switch, and all of the profits went to raising money for a mental health charity called the JED Foundation. Nintendo sent a cease and desist letter to the guy who designed them, forcing him to stop all operation. What a cool company. Nintendo Switch Online in 2022 is worse than Xbox Live was in 2001. This service costs actual money. But hey, if the demand's so high and the service is so terrible, why don't they improve on it, you might ask? Well, it's simple. They just don't have to. Nintendo games are platform exclusive. You can only play Nintendo games on Nintendo platforms. So the online being god-awful just doesn't matter. It doesn't affect the amount of revenue they make from it. Because if you want to play Smash Ultimate Online, you have only one option to do so. Their shitty online service is the only way. Other consoles don't have this luxury. If Xbox Live is a very laggy, very unstable service, that will incentivize people to go play on PlayStation's online service instead. Because the overwhelming majority of games that people want to play exist on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox, but not Nintendo games. Nintendo has no competition for their games. They have a monopoly on their own games, so they get away with doing the bare minimum for their online service, which cannot be said for other platforms out there. If they have a bad service, people will switch to their competitor. But what's the consumer meant to do when they have no competitor to switch to? Nothing. The answer's nothing. But these other companies are competitors, just indirectly. So let's just take a look at those companies for a second. So speaking of competitors, why is all this such a problem? Because Nintendo has the legal right to do all of this stuff. It's their intellectual property and they can do with it as they please, right? Why do we have the right to be mad about it? Well, the simple answer is that Nintendo is an outlier. Pretty much every other games company out there, despite all the flaws that they might have, don't even do half of this stuff. Because they understand the value of their brand image and their public perception. Let's take a look at modding and fan games. Valve has the Steam Workshop, where users can submit custom content that can literally be added to the game if Valve deems it good enough. Valve obviously understands the value of modding, since some of their biggest IPs were born of fan games and mods. But there's others as well, like A Hat in Time having mod contests to stimulate the modding community, or how Devil Daggers has modding tools and tutorials hosted on their website, or how Sega literally hired fan modders and musicians to make an officially licensed Sonic game, Sonic Mania, a game that was better than almost every Sega-made Sonic game ever released. Most companies see the value in this stuff, because it's super important to let this stuff thrive, because it lets their communities thrive and get excited about their IPs. And cracking down on fan games is essentially cracking down on your most dedicated fans. There's zero personal gain in attacking these fan creations, but lots of personal gain in leaving them alone. But what about music? Well, as usual, indie devs reign supreme. Indie developers are very willing to sell their soundtracks as albums, both physically and digitally, as well as hosting them on streaming services. They also often allow the composer themselves to keep the rights to the music, and sell the music on Bandcamp, or host the music on YouTube and stuff like that. This allows indie dev composers to actually make a living, which they wouldn't be able to do otherwise. Nintendo doesn't do any of this stuff, but honestly, a lot of AAA developers lag behind when it comes to respecting their video game music. When it comes to tournaments, the biggest esports in the world all have one thing in common: developer support. Valve helps fund its tournaments and its prize pools for Counter-Strike and Dota, and Riot Games funds their Valorant and League of Legends prize pools as well. Smash Melee is a huge esport with not only no support from Nintendo, but with them actively pushing against their success. So who knows how gargantuan the Melee scene could have been with the direct cooperation from Nintendo over the last 21 years. Tournaments are such a great way to generate excitement around a game, and once again, Nintendo seems to not even slightly understand the modern video game landscape and fails to adapt to it in yet another way. At least they might be finally changing their ways though. There's also companies that try to keep their old catalogue of games as accessible as possible. Turns out a much more effective way of combating piracy and emulation is making it way easier to just buy the game directly from you. Attacking ROM sites is the worst way to combat piracy, because attacking ROM sites doesn't make people not want to play your games. But if you just sell the games directly to the consumer, the desire to pirate them shrinks dramatically. And it probably goes without saying, but Nintendo striking YouTube videos for featuring music or footage from Nintendo games is such a bad idea that it is almost comical that Nintendo did it for so long. They seem to have stopped ever since the Nintendo Creator Program died a deserving death, but the fact that it happened at all is just absolutely baffling. Because, like I said, the free advertisement that games get from having likeable personalities praise their games is literally priceless. But Nintendo would much rather have the short-term revenue increase from this abomination than see the long-term benefits of a ton of free marketing and an unconditionally loved brand. Nintendo is a bad company that makes good games. They know how to make games, but they don't understand PR, marketing, brand image, software design, or consumer-friendly practice. Will Nintendo change for the better in the future? I don't know. Probably not. But if there is a silver lining to all this, Nintendo is showing that they have a capacity for change by actually sponsoring a Melee tournament for the first time in history. But only time will tell if they actually manage to fuck this up or not. Please do tell me in the comments any examples of Nintendo's scumminess that I might have missed. Also just gonna flash this up on the screen. No reason why, don't worry about it, don't even pay. But here's hoping that one day, Nintendo learns from its competitors. Maybe one day they'll stop viewing the video game industry like it's 1998. Thanks for watching.